What's up, Thrashers, and welcome back to Thrash Reviews, where yours truly, Thrash Maniac 99, continues to review upcoming hard rock and heavy metal albums in the calendar year of 2016. And today is a special one because it's the third studio release from Norwegian metal band Kvelertak, and it's called NATTESFERD. Doing the best I can to pronounce these Norwegian words because this is going to be quite interesting because this band formed around the mid-2000s, and this is their third album, and they are on Roadrunner Records. This is their second album for Roadrunner, and also this is the first album that they're doing without the production help of Converge guitarist Kurt Balu. Or Balu, or however you may pronounce his last name. The guy from Converge, guitarist of Converge. Kurt. We'll just call him Kurt. With that said, so yeah, this is their third release, and it's typical with Kvelertak, all the lyrics are in Norwegian, as well as most of the song titles, so this is going to be kind of a pain in the ass to try to pronounce some of these titles. But, basically, for those who don't know Kvelertak, Kvelertak is a metal band that combines a lot of different musical styles. They implement some traditional heavy metal influence, some black metal influence as far as the vocals, some hardcore influences, some hard rock, some rock and roll, some punk, and even a little tiny shred of thrash can be thrown into the mix to give it a more aggressive sound. But essentially they're combining four elements: the black metal vocals, traditional heavy metal, hardcore, and rock and roll is what they're going for sonically and musically. So with that said, this album NATTESFERD, let's take a look at this. The first track on the album, and I'm going to try my best to pronounce this, Dentro Phil for Jagstrassel. Basically, from what I can tell from the title, this is a Viking-oriented lyrical track, clocking in at nearly 6 minutes in length, and you just get these like old-school heavy metal-sounding guitar riffs, as well as some of that spirit of like the old rock and roll era from like the 50s and 60s. And I like what Kvelertak does with this song because it's showing their identity of combining a lot of old school rock and roll, heavy metal, extreme metal elements, throw it into their own style in order to create their own subgenre. Black and roll is what they like to call their music sometimes, I suppose, or what a lot of fans call their music. I just don't think it's really a genre. I just think it's a good idea for a genre, but I don't think it's really a genre yet, because we have yet to see the spawn of Kvelertak, but you never know. But with that said, this opening track just has a lot of those, like I said, old school metal riffs with that kind of spirit and brawn of like old school rock and roll thrown into it with those very screechy black metal vocals, which made for an interesting album opener. Let's continue on to the next track, which is called 1985, and somehow this band is like obsessed with that year. It was a great year for metal because that year you had albums from bands such as Slayer, Celtic Frost, Possessed, Exodus, Anthrax, Megadeth, so on and so forth. And this song, if I can remember right, implemented some blast beat patterns into the song, and it was more of like the simpler blast, which is just blasting the snare and then just using your right hand on the cymbals, just going that kind of blast beat is what you're getting with a couple tracks, including this one. And again, just like the first track, bringing in some of that old school flavor to the riffs, and as well as the drumming patterns sounded very similar to bands such as Merciful Fate, and even a little tiny schmed of like Age of Quarrel era Cro-Mags can be thrown in there as well. So they're going all over the place on tracks such as this. Let's continue on. The next track I want to talk about is SVARTMESSE. Messe? I don't know. This is a 3.5 minute track, and this is probably my favorite track of the album because it's probably the most old school sounding song on the entire album. I'm like getting a sense of that 70s rock and roll style from bands such as Steve Miller Band and Nazareth. Bands along those lines are mixing that along with the black metal vocals and some of those traditional heavy metal aesthetics thrown in there. And it just made for a very wonderful tune that can get stuck in your head. And I know, for me, I'm going to probably be listening to the song over and over again because this is a hell of a tune that just, like I said, it's catchy and it really gets you going. Let's conclude with the final track on the album, which is an odd one. It's called Necrodamus. And this is a near 5 minute closer, and this kind of is a more kind of softer, not in terms of like the vocals by any means, but like some of the guitars sounded not as heavy as the other songs on the album. Even a little bit of acoustic guitar was heard a little bit on there too, and this track just continues that theme that I'm talking about of combining those old school elements of metal and rock and roll music, even hardcore as well. And it just made for a hell of a closing track that concluded an interesting album, to say the least. So with that said, pretty much what this album entails is the band's over-obsession of all things black metal, traditional heavy metal, hardcore, rock and roll, and punk rock, and hard rock, all thrown into the mix, into their sound, in order to create something that's very fresh. Like, this is a really refreshing album for the genre of heavy metal. And it just, like I keep saying, it's kind of beating a dead horse here, but it's bringing back some of those old school elements that we are missing from metal today. That's why I loved albums from earlier this year, such as Cauldron's album and Ruin, because it sounded so old school and it was done well, like as if it was created now. Kvelertak is doing the same exact thing, only in a little bit more of a weird realm, because of their black metal vocals being implemented into their sound. After all, they are a Norwegian band, so of course, being from Norway, they're going to be influenced by some of that stuff. Also, the production on this album was very well done, but also raw. This was a raw album, and it made it sound like as if you were in the 1980s, and that's another good important part of this particular release because of the way it sounds. And there you have it. So overall, if I were to rate this album, I absolutely enjoyed this album. I recommend you guys get this album. A 91 out of 100 for NATTESFERD by Kvelertak. Definitely go pick this up if you haven't already. Not one song on this album was a dud. This was just top to bottom an old school heavy metal masterpiece for 2016, and we will definitely be talking about this album later in the year. But thank you guys for watching this video. Peace, and have a good Friday.